Welcome to this episode of Studio Z. This time it's a remote Studio Z. We're not in our usual location. We're actually here in London with a completely mobile setup, so a little bit different. But by traveling, we're able to get some really excellent guests. And so today I'm super excited to be joined by Guy Podjarny, who's going to introduce himself and tell you a little bit about his story right now. Guy, introduce yourself to the audience. Who are you? What do you do?
Thanks for having me. Sorry for disappointing without the British accent despite being in London. So I'm the founder of Snyk. Snyk is a developer security company. Basically, our premise was that as DevOps came along, security as it worked in waterfall era was not fit for purpose, couldn't keep up, and you had to rethink security. And kind of go from an auditor mindset that something funnels through you and you assess it to more of a platform approach that helps developers embrace security. That had to happen, and that the way to do that was to build a developer tooling company that tackles security, so that we build solutions that developers actually want to use. And so that's the kind of core premise of Snyk. We're about 8.5 years old now.
Wow.
We're about 1,000 people.
Wow.
So it's grown.
Yeah.
It's been an interesting journey. I'm sure we'll talk about some parts of it. And yeah, just like I said a little bit before that, I'm born and raised in Israel, went through the cyber parts of the Israeli army, spent about sort of 9 years in cyber sort of application security companies through a couple of acquisitions, from an Israeli company got acquired by a Canadian company, got acquired by IBM, founded a web performance company that got me into DevOps, and sold that to Akamai, where I was a CTO for a bunch of years. And then I moved to Canada somewhere in that journey, and then moved to London with Akamai before founding Snyk. So that's my journey.
Wow, I mean, and what a great introduction, and so much alignment with Zuplo and what we're doing, the focus on developers and that developer first story, so I'd love to get into that. One of the things we talk about a lot on this is sort of engineering and product culture. That's probably where we're going to spend most of our time. And in particular, we like to talk about how your company is deployed. And so, we had the CTO of Atlassian on recently, a very remote company with folks in Australia. I think the founders are in, and then the headquarters were in San Francisco, and Rajiv was in Bellevue. How do you think about Snyk? Is it a remote company? How do you think about that?
I guess I think about Snyk as a distributed company. And we're remote friendly. We have quite a few remote employees, but we do like our hubs and our offices and the advantages they offer. It has I think a relevant origin story here. So when I started Snyk, I initially was kind of wondering whether or not I was in London, whether or not I want an office in Israel. And I was kind of keen to tap my network over there, knew some amazing people there. But I've had experience in the journey in which multiple offices created very much an us versus them mentality. And I was quite concerned about that. I got pretty badly burned before. And so kind of eventually realized, I really want to tap into that sort of, Israel talent. And so I found a couple of great co-founders, Danny and Asaf, who joined me to lead that branch. And we decided to build the company as this sort of two-headed monster that, it coexisted. It wasn't about one being a headquarter versus the other.
Okay.
And we made all sorts of rules that would try to prevent the us versus them reality, right?
So by us versus them, you mean, because you've got Office A and Office B, they become sort of cliques almost, and they're...
Yeah, and oftentimes it's functional. As you sort of say, whatever, the front end would be built over here and the back end over there, or you would say, a certain product would be developed in one spot or the other, or what is very common, by the way, in Israel, which is R&D might be in Israel, so development and engineering might be in Israel, and then maybe the go-to-market is elsewhere.
Got it.
And those, they don't really allow you to tap into the sort of the true local talent, because oftentimes there's people that do all sorts of things. They make promotion paths more difficult, but more important is they create oftentimes an adversarial relationship of the next project who wins it, especially when you have two development centers.
Right.
And so to try and kind of break away from that, what we said was no team will be co-located. So instead of saying that there will be the Israel team, development team with a team lead and sort of builds that up, and then there would be another one in the UK, and this is London and Tel Aviv, we would have every team intentionally be divided. And that creates a certain overhead for the manager and for the team operation, but it allows for all sorts of other goodness. But first and foremost, it prevents everybody is in it together.
Yeah.
Naturally, I think your closest affinity is to the people that sit next to you, that are physical proximity, and for the people that you work with. And so by creating this, team split, it meant that the company really kind of grew in cohesion, right? It's sort of, because people had, they were both close to their physical kind of close office mates, and they were close to their teammates.
That are in another location.
Might be geographically away.
Make that real for me then. It's like the designer could be in London, but the engineer that person's working with could be in Tel Aviv.
Yeah, even kind of within the same role. So a team of 5 people that might have a team lead and 4 engineers, call it, and then maybe there's a product manager, maybe there's a designer. They would just be divided roughly evenly. It's never perfect. Between the 2 locations. So the team might have 2 engineers and a team lead in one spot. Maybe the product manager and 2 other engineers are in the other location. And so teams are naturally, once you build it that way, the other thing that happens, first of all, again, the team is cohesive and it isn't about Israel or UK, but also once you do that, you establish good habits that allow other offices to interact as well as remote employees, because the work naturally needs to become virtual. So the calls, I think the worst realities are the ones in which you have 5 team members that are local and then 1 person is remote. And so for the remote person, that's a very bad experience.
Yes. Yeah.
But when the team is divided into 2 locations, it naturally communication happens over text and in Slack, a lot of things happen over Zoom, documents have to be written. A lot of the hallway conversation, there's a price for that. You might lose some of that sort of brainstorming, and we could talk about how we compensated for that. But I think the methodology that evolves really is one that is remote friendly. And so we've kind of built that, and we did become remote friendly because of that, even though it wasn't the intent. And so pretty quickly we had somewhere between a quarter and a third kind of fluctuating remote. Today we're actually trying to, within R&D, manage that and be a little bit more location based.
Okay.
But we still have a substantial amount of remote people because the practices, the sort of the way the company operates allows them to integrate easily.
So there is a lot to unpack here, because that's almost the antithesis of what Atlassian said. Atlassian, they build these sort of bands of teams that work together. I think it's more or less around time zone. How different is the time between Tel Aviv and London?
Yeah, so 2 hours, and that's an important one. And we've always we did break through. We can talk about that, to the East Coast, but indeed time zones you can't win. And so for a very long time we said stay within the sort of the Tel Aviv to London time zone region, because you can't really win time zones. We did need to deal with the different work weeks. In Israel, it's Sunday to Thursday versus Monday to Friday, which is most of the rest of the world.
Okay, interesting. Okay, so you said you did some things to compensate for this overhead, this sort of transactional overhead. What's some examples of things you did then?
Well, I think the most obvious one is bringing people together at a certain frequency. And I think, so really to me, we did these all hands aligned to the planning horizon, frequency that aligns to the planning horizon of the company. So at the beginning that was 3-4 months, but really it was also flying 3-4 people
exactly.
To the other side. When we would fly over, the team that was flying over also got a lot of bonding experience, and we would, partly to save money, we would rent an Airbnb with a bunch of rooms on it, would sort of be there. There's all sorts of great stories around coming together. So the team that was hosting played host, and so there was a big deal of taking you to sort of local food places and some local culture, and then that got reciprocated on the other side when the team traveled to the other spot. And so I think these all hands events, these kind of physical gatherings, were very significant. They made for very intense, very focused planning sessions, out of which we came out well aligned with a foundation, a basis for what we're going to work with or what we're going to work on. and from there we could work remotely, and we didn't need as much the conversations, and so that was very valuable. And in some ways, it was better than just the occasional, hey, can I grab you and we'll do a brainstorming session in the room. Pros and cons. And as the company grew, it also became kind of more of an effort to do those, but also our planning horizon changed, and so we delayed them, so they had started to happen less frequently. Then the pandemic was a different story, and it's like it doesn't. This approach of flying everybody together all the time, does have a cost element to it, and it does have a size constraint. But at the beginning, it was very important to create the cohesion, and it allowed that sort of alignment foundation, and it forced us. I oftentimes think that board meetings are pretty useless, but more board meeting preparation is priceless. The needs to stop and assess. What is it you're going to do? And I think similarly here, the preparation towards these all hands, because it was this intense week. It was really to think, what is it that we want to focus on? What is it that is the best use of our time? How do we make the most of it? And I think that focus allowed us to eventually build correctly to basically help us focus our actual actions, not just how we work.
I very much agree on that sort of forced function of preparation, making you step back, and the board meeting does a great job with that. So I'm interested to ask a little bit about your planning horizons, but I will comment actually now we've talked more. I think you're less antithetical to the Atlassian model. They talk a lot about time zone alignment. They talk a lot about getting people together, I think, on a quarterly basis. So no surprise that we do the same thing. Zuplo's a remote company, I think we could say, rather than distribute. We don't have an office as of yet. But we do get everybody together a couple of times a year.
And one thing, because I think what we didn't talk too much about sort of the remote versus offices. But I think it's important to emphasize that the advantage of the approach I said versus just remote is that it still has the office. And so the energy level from being in the office, especially when you work higher, longer hours, was very much there. The talent attraction, so the ability to recruit locally and be a bit more efficient because you're hiring in those locations and building some local brand, that came into play. There's advantages over time as you grow. There's also subsidiary overhead and things like that bias you in favor of picking your locations. And so these locations, that's why I think about Snyk as a distributed company more so than remote. It's remote friendly, but it's more distributed first. Allowed us to do that. And also when we acquired companies, and we've made a bunch of acquisitions, these offices became sort of hubs. Probably most notable is we acquired a company in Zurich called Deep Code, which became, they have a lot of relationships with the ETH University over there, and they're big in AI-based program analysis, and this was about 3 years ago. So, it's an amazing team. A lot of the work that they do was quite different. They were very tech-heavy, very research-heavy because of the sort of the subject domain. As a result of that, the culture of that office was different. So the way they approached the style, and over time we also added a few people to that office that do other stuff, that's not that work, and then we added some people that would work with that team elsewhere. So we worked on dividing that team, but these sort of local culture hubs that do have a different weight to them really came into play. So again, everything has trade-offs, but I think that was significant, the advantages of the office.
It's hard to argue with that. Actually, it sounds like a lot of the I worked at Facebook, had a big central sort of headquarters over in Menlo Park, obviously in sort of the Bay Area, but had pretty significant satellite offices here in London, and that's what they describe like satellites. So you can argue that was sort of a distributed model. The time zone thing, I want to pull on that a little bit more. So Zurich, not far away, pretty similar time zone, like 1 hour or something. Do you have folks that are more extreme? You must have some folks on the West Coast now of the States, right?
So actually, very select few. So we've somewhat entertainingly, we've acquired a company in Halifax. That's the way we broke through, and that's 4 hours away from London. That's an unusual Atlantic time zone spot. And then, that already included some people on the East Coast. And it did open up the East Coast, and we now have a substantial, I'm not sure how much, number of people on the East Coast. And even that, Israel to East Coast, which is 7 hours difference, is a bit hard. And so where we can, today that we're bigger, we do try to have a little bit of like preferences. And so maybe you'd rather not have Israel and East Coast, you'd rather have Israel and London and maybe London.
This is the pairing team. So you're not going to have an engineer from the East Coast. In most cases, it's an exception if you have an engineer on the East Coast, part of a team that's with engineers in Tel Aviv, for example.
Correct, yeah. And it's the sheer logistics of when do you book the team meeting, when do you have time. And so we try to bias in favor of that. And we have a few exceptions for very talented individuals or people that, for a variety of exception cases, that justify people being further west in the US. But otherwise, we do still try to keep it within that time zone. It's largely true for the company, not just engineering. But specifically it's true for engineering. Of course, the exception to that is sort of Salesforce and things like that, people that need to be closer to the customer.
Got it. Okay, yeah. Makes sense, that makes sense. All right, let's change tack for a minute and talk about the sort of nature of the business. So there's, one way of thinking about culture is, are you product-led? Are you a design-led company? Are you a data-led company? Like people say Facebook was a data-led company, right? Are you design-led? Like Instagram is very design-led. How would you describe Snyk?
Yeah, Snyk is clearly a product-led company. I think a lot of what we think about is in service of the product. We talk about user needs, we talk about the core premises of what does, in the original Notion, right? What does a developer need to be able to successfully kind of embrace a product? And in fact, the whole kind of creation of Snyk was around saying, let's build a developer tooling company versus a cybersecurity company that happened to tackle security. And so that included a lot of what is a dev tooling company, what do developers look for in a product, how does that differ from what security people look for, what does it imply in brand, but also very much in the product, what is the usability, what are the workflows that we should integrate with, what should be emphasized. And then we built some pretty impressive technology, in my opinion, but it was always in service of that. Probably a good example of that is we figured one of the, in the beginning we built, the very first thing we shipped was a command line interface to be able to scan your application for open source vulnerabilities. So CLI, there's a bunch of like DevX kind of paradigms on it that are known. And we saw people use it, we got some good initial traction of it, but people didn't put it in the build. The build was too much additional friction for them to put it into because breaking the build is a bigger action. It's just more involved. You needed more consensus from the rest of the team. And so they didn't really do that. And to try and avoid that, we realized from a product perspective, we needed like a next workflow with GitHub to just do next, and then install it onto the repo. To be able to do that, we needed to look at the source code of a dependency manifest and be able to say, is there a vulnerability here? So we needed to approximate the dependency tree. We needed to kind of expand that out, which is actually fairly hard technology to do. But that facilitated the user experience we wanted, which was do next, and then just we'll monitor the repo for you, and we'll tell you in the pull request whether you're adding a low vulnerable library or not. And hey, when there's a vulnerability we find, we want to open a fixed pull request to you. That user experience description is what drove us, and then we figure out how do we overcome the technology problem to doing it. Our static analysis, the AI-based program analysis, which is incredible tech that I don't fully understand, was really in the service of static analysis products being unusable for developers because they're too slow, they're too inaccurate. And so we needed kind of some new math, but we kept not going into that space because it didn't allow for the user experience that we wanted.
Interesting.
So very product driven.
So I mean that resonates with me and what we do at Zuplo in terms. Well, I think so. Let's just explore that for a second. We think very much about, we design for the developer persona, which I think is a little bit different to our competitors, who I would argue design kind of for the buyer of an organization. So some very, very senior CIO or something in a large organization is often the decision maker. That's not someone we spend a lot of time thinking about other than in the sales process. When we're building the product, we're very laser focused on sort of IC engineering and engineering leadership. Is that a fair reflection of how you think about it?
It is. I think the core concept of product led, of being product led, is to anchor on the user versus the buyer. The initial kind of perception, the problem we set out to address is the fact that the most important user of the product was the developer. Because the problem everybody was facing is they just weren't using it. So they were producing insecure software. And so we thought about that as the most important user, and you anchor them. The security person is an important user for us as well, and we just intentionally prioritize the developer in the early days, and today we balance them a lot more as we sort of work with bigger and bigger contexts. And so I think that is like very much a part of how your philosophy evolves. I still think that you can build products that are sort of product led, that focus on the buyer and on the commercial. They typically don't align too much to maybe a product led approach, but more about the business problem and the business pain. But yeah, it also varies. I think one of the maybe interesting tidbits in Snyk is so we anchored on being able to break through to that user, to that developer, but the distance between the user and the buyer for Snyk is actually quite far. If you're building a product-led company and you're building, your user is your buyer when you get them sufficiently engaged. That's easiest, right? That's the person deciding to buy. If it's the team lead of that person, that's also like a relatively short distance. And so whether it's whatever Notion or whether it's something that is the team, or maybe an observability product that it's okay for just this team to use. Security tends to bias for breadth. It's not practical for a security person to have every director of engineering use a different tool to govern their code security. And so the distance between the developer and that security person is quite high. How many more people you need to jump in. And so we built a product for the user. We built a freemium model to really be able to build a good product for the developer and to break through. But from a go-to-market perspective, we had to combine that with also outbound motions or other ways to be able to reach the buyer and then win them over in significant part thanks to the fact that we've demonstrated developer adoption already.
Interesting. Actually, let's just noodle on this. I don't have a better word than religious right now. Topic of product-led growth, which has kind of become a dirty word, almost the PLG. And then some people are saying, well, you need sales, which I don't think most folks doing PLG ever argue with that. And so versus product-led sales. Any thought on this? Is it just a meaningless debate, or?
I think the reality is that the world, and specifically engineering, is increasingly relying on empowered teams, and those teams are seeking tools that are right for them. And so I think this notion of product-led is indeed biasing for that user. I think we're in a moment of time from a financial markets perspective in which empowerment is the dirty word more so than the product-led. It's much because of the more sort of financial constraints that companies are under. It's harder for some CFO to say, hey, I want my developers to pick the best tool for them. And there's much more bias in kind of a shift from this best of breeds to best of suites pressure to say, hey, can I use Salesforce, and Salesforce has all these dozen other sort of products around it, and can I make do? Can my team manage with those products? And maybe in all sorts of spots it's not the perfect fit for them. While in 2021 and 2020, I think there was a lot more allowance, affordance for the teams to pick the best product for it.
Is this sort of a, if we take the extreme sort of, maybe it was a zero interest rate phenomena, maybe it was just the hype around recruiting tech, and then we saw Elon let go of, 75% of the Twitter engineering team, and the thing is more or less still working, whatever you think of Twitter. I don't want to get into that. You think that's sort of part of the same thing as this empowerment? You think those are related?
I think it's a pendulum swing. At the end of the day, for most tech businesses, for sure, and increasingly most companies become tech businesses, the vast majority of their spend is on employees. It's on sort of the payroll. And so if you can make people more productive, you're providing a lot of value.
Right.
And so I think in the long run, because people are also getting more powerful. AI now is demonstrating that even more, but an individual in the company can do so much more than they could have before. And because of that, we're reliant on their productivity, and because of that, we're empowering them to do more, because that's what makes the business competitive, makes it successful. And so I think that trend will continue. I think we were probably too far in one side, with the pendulum swing. I think we're probably swinging quite far the other side, because a lot of companies need to become profitable quickly, and so they have to tighten it up, and they might be sacrificing some long-term benefits from it. But so I think we'll settle somewhere in the middle. So I don't anticipate product-led growth shifting or changing. What I do worry about is it's actually very, very hard to embrace product-led growth when you haven't done it before. Developers, as an example, you'd be very hard pressed to name a single company that has started and established scale in a non-developer friendly fashion and then built a developer led motion as well.
Added that on later. Yeah.
It's very, very hard to find those. I mean, they might exist, but it's hard for me to think of one, and definitely there aren't many. And so if people in this current climate build more companies that abandon that, it's going to be hard for those companies to adapt to the product. And it might mean that in sort of 3 years' time or something, there will be a new cohort of companies that are basically looking to take a product-led approach to the companies that are formed this year that might be taking.
We talk about this all the time. Very inspired by Auth0. I think they did a great job, and I'll talk about them versus Okta in my opinion. Okta tried to copy what they did. Ended up buying the company, as you know. I think it's we talk about, we still want to focus very much on Zuplo on small customers and winning hobbyist developers, because we think it's impossible to build a big enterprise-centric company and then sort of move down market, which sounds very similar to what you're saying about build a non-product-led company and become a product-led company.
It's not the same. I think you can build a very successful sort of sales-led company that focuses on the buyer, that does go down market, that does offer products to sort of smaller businesses that are more packaged and opinionated, that have kind of less customizability, that maybe serve as a slice of functionality. So I think that doesn't actually happen. I think it's the bottom up versus sales sort of top down sort of sales approach that I think is different. Auth0 and Okta is interesting. I would claim that both Auth0 and Okta were right, because Okta, they shipped a product that it's sort of minimum unit of value. The smallest thing, the smallest offering was your entire company for all of the SaaS products that you can is going to log in this fashion. That's not a bottom-up product. That's a top-down, significant, heavy-duty decision. Versus Auth0, when they said, well, our minimum unit is like someone is adding some role-based access control to some app or the other, and so that happens. That's a small decision made in many, 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 many different places, and so you want to really reduce the friction and allow that individual to pick Auth0 for it. I think what's very hard, and we've seen that, is for a company like Okta with that muscle of top-down to go off and win the hearts and minds of the developers, and bring a product like Auth0 had before. So that's why I think the move to acquire Auth0, financials aside, you can debate those, but I think in terms of bringing them in versus the build, had a lot of merits to it.
Was very smart. Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. Let's talk about company values. So, do you have, the Amazon has its like 14 statements. Facebook has its posters and its these notes that it writes, and there's lots of examples. Atlassian have lots of very swear word laden, very Australian values like don't bleep the customer and so on. Does Snyk have things like this?
So we do. I think. If you start from the philosophy, the goal is alignment, right? Like what you want is everybody in the company to be rowing in the same direction. And from a cultural perspective, but also a ways of working. Cultural is the people you bring in terms of their sentiment and such, but a lot of it is the ways of working. You want some core principles that, especially as you grow, they act as these kind of guidelines to try and maintain alignment. They're not the only way to maintain alignment, but they're an important part of it, and they need to have some longevity. And so at the beginning we didn't define these values because you knew everybody and you sort of hired everybody, and then I forget. I think we're maybe about 40 people. I think when we did the first values workshop, maybe less even, maybe in the 20s. And to me, it was just because it was important to just sort of sit down and have everybody agree on what is it that we value and we don't, and to have everybody involved in it. So we did like a little values workshop. At the time, I think we came out like it was very hard for us to come up with like 11 items that were there, and then nobody remembers 11 items. Like there's, I don't know how 14 kind of really works.
Yeah.
It's just, it's just very, very hard. So, we've reduced them, we've gone through a bunch of iterations. At some point we get down to 4, now we have 5 values. And I think they serve as things to refer to, and they're simple enough that you can give them different interpretations, but they lead to the same spots.
Are you going to give an example?
So a good one, for instance, is care deeply. Snyk is not a good place for a 9-to-5 job. It is a place in which we care deeply. And care deeply has multiple meanings. It has caring about individual employees, and we care about people. We care about the environment. We're a 1% pledge 1% company on it, and we have a big Snyk impact motion, and we care about that. But we also care about our company, our customers, and care about their success. At some point, our CFO asked me, he says, "Hey, should we have some form of like a compete to win value and things like that?" And we discussed this, and like we don't really need that, because like people care about one another. If a salesperson asks an engineer for help, they help them because they want to help them succeed. And so we drive a lot out of that caring, and it can backfire, and sometimes caring can result in being overly sensitive or sort of not raising a topic. So each of these things have a thing that you might need to battle, and I think over time we've evolved it. Maybe I'll give you another example which is relevant. We have a value called ship it. We believe in iterations. We believe in just sort of get it out there. There's even some hubris in sort of thinking you're smarter than the world, and you're going to get in your cave and build something for a year and come out and sort of have it be perfect. And so we ship it, and ship it it's such a useful term. It's like, okay, just ship it, like we're talking about this thing, just ship it and let's see what happens. Over time, in R&D, the value in the company is still ship it, but in R&D we talk a lot more about ship it and own it, because what has happened is clearly you bias if you put the weight on delivering it, then you might have come at the expense of some of the quality controls that you put in place before. And so, but I think we talk about care deeply, we talk about ship it. And I think that, so the latest, we're not going to go through them all, but the latest that we've added was always be learning. I think we call it learn always. And I think that's an emphasis on individual growth. One of the challenges as the company grows is when growth outpaces talent, when individuals can't grow to the scope that the company has grown, and therefore you need to shrink their role, or in more extreme cases, move them out. And so emphasizing and investing in helping people always be learning. It also has another interpretation, which is, this isn't a value, but a good phrase we often use is you either win or you learn. When we lose things, when you fail in something, you want to celebrate learnings. And so this is, okay, learn always. And so I think values evolve over time. They have to be concise. It's okay that they're a little bit ambiguous. As long as they drive behavior. And they do get a little bit formalized. At some point we had a ridiculously easy to work with. That was a value. Ridiculously easy to work with.
Meaning the product or the people or
everything.
Both? Yeah, okay.
Everything. It was the easy use of the product. It was around how we work with it, and actually even came back as like these were some words that a customer has sort of told us on it. And then Geva, our sort of COO at the time, was popularized it for us, and so it was a good term. At some point, sort of felt almost like I don't know if it's just sort of the corporatization of it, but sort of felt like we wanted to be a bit more, I don't know, sort of refined maybe in some of our wording, and so that one was maybe that's one I miss a little bit, but we chose to move it.
Yeah, I like that one. I mean, ship it. I will say, almost everyone I've spoken to, or great founders or leaders I've worked with, like this notion of like move fast, code is cheap, like ship quickly, iterate, learn, get it into the market.
People think they have more time than they actually do.
Yeah, and the idea that if you're not embarrassed by the first thing you put out, you ship too late. It seems like a very common thing that people behind great companies really value. So it was interesting. You said you were about 20 to 40 people. I can't remember exactly when you did this values workshop. But before that, there were no posters. There were no written values. It was kind of emergent culture. It was like you were close enough to. You were a solo founder, if I remember. Is that correct?
So I had two slightly late co-founders that kind of stuff, and they were very significant in everything around the company, but also in the shaping of the culture. Okay. They were also the ones forming the Israeli office.
I see. Okay, yeah, you mentioned that. Yeah. So folks are close enough together that just the the behaviors you folks are exhibiting can be picked up on others, and that's kind of where the culture emerges from. And then you get everyone together in a group and say, let's talk about how this company behaves, or the things we like about it, and sort of try to distill or, boil down the values that came out of the workshop. Is that?
Yeah, correct. And I think it really, at the end of the day, it's supposed to give us something to point to when we think something is wrong, something to refer to when we're interviewing a person that we're hiring, something. So it really is, once you get to enough scale. And I do think that it starts being reasonable at that sort of 20% range, because when one person interviews, how likely is it they're using the same traits or looking for the same properties as another person? So you need to get to some size in which it matters. Also, to an extent at the beginning, as long as myself, or later me or one of my co-founders were interviewing every individual person, then we basically act as a bit of a values filter on it. At some point you need to start codifying it, and it almost kind of empowers the team, because we talked about this, and now others might be kind of allowed to filter for values, because we've discussed what those values are. But I do think that probably the toughest part is reducing them to a few. It's like in any prioritization exercise. It's like, this is also important. Fine. But you need to pick the most important items. Otherwise, you dilute the value of everything.
It's not prioritization if it doesn't hurt, right? Yeah. Funny, so you've answered about 3 questions I had ahead of time here. So I spoke with Anna Debenham, was your first product manager at Snyk, is that right?
Correct. She's actually joined as a developer. She's trying to think. So she, Anna first declined to join the company, and I chased her, and eventually I managed to get her to take a contract with the company. And I think that contract would have placed her as, maybe our 3rd employee after the co-founders or something like that. And then I think 3 months later, she actually converted to an employee. She's been an amazing part of sort of shaping Snyk's culture on it.
Yeah, okay. So I was asking.
She moved to product management after.
I didn't realize that. Okay, so I asked her some things to talk to you about, and you answered quite a lot, like when should you solidify? So it sounds, one measure is the number of people, like 20 to 40, but it sounds like when you're hiring is starting to scale up and you can't meet everybody, where you can't have regular touch points with the whole company, that's the point where you need to build these tools to the propaganda of Snyk, if you will. I was told about a book called The Culture Map. Was this the thing you folks did? Tell me about that.
Yeah, I think, so the multi-locations also came with multiple cultures. And it's interesting, specifically we had the UK and Israel, and those are very different cultures, especially when it comes to, bluntness, and there's this trait that's in the Culture Map book, I think mentioned as well, and in negotiation tactics, which is how long of a pause do you need in a conversation to interject and start talking. And I think in Israel it's like a negative number. You just need to notice that someone is kind of trailing off in their talks if you're going to interject. And I would always, I'm an Israeli, I live in Canada, and I'm
very polite place.
And I feel like I would joke when I was in Canada that I'm a very polite Israeli or a very assertive Canadian. But anyways, I am a firm believer that, the vast majority of problems in an organization, especially as it's coming up, are the result of miscommunication. And so over-communication was a big deal, helping people communicate correctly. And a big part of that has to do with cultural differences. Like when you add cultural differences and biases, you're strengthening the company in the sense that you're bringing strength. I think the fearlessness that came out of Israel, including maybe some of the brashness and some of the draft, was key to Snyk's success, as was the more methodical approach and the sensitivity to developer experience, some of the product architecture that came from the London ecosystem. And I think Snyk is the combination of the two. I think that made Snyk what it is, including additions that we've added after. However, they also represent opportunity for conflict. And so what we've done is we've invested a lot in talking through those. And one of the examples was the Culture Map book that we encouraged people to read, which just talks about it. It's a great book. It's one of multiples of it. But I think the key is as you grow, and for context, we've grown from 23 people at the end of 1 year to 84 people in the next year to 250 people in the next year.
Wow.
And it's like big jumps. and it's not like everybody's like laid back during the time. Everybody's super busy as we grow. And throughout that time, I would always get the question of how do we preserve culture? You know, how do we not lose it? So first of all, I always loved getting that question because it meant at any point in time, people felt there was a thing to preserve. You know, people felt like there was a strength, and that's true all the way through to today. And that I think is a measure of success. But it is indeed a challenge, and I think a lot of that comes down like there's incentives. You know, what do you reward? What do you what do you penalize? And then there's just investing in communication. So the culture map was one of the ways to do it, but I would just. If you are a remote company or a distributed company, you have to make people aware of what might be deemed urgent. For you know, in the British phrasing of it, might totally go over the head of an Israeli, and what might be deemed offensive for a Brit might be, you know, total regular speak to an Israeli, and those are just like two of many examples of it. So you want to raise that awareness. You want to really try to flag them and then get those people on a call or talk to someone else on the team who has a better personal relationship on it. You just want to diffuse it as quickly as you can, but you also want to just sort of surface awareness to it up front. So
you're reminding me of two graphics that I think we should actually put on screen. One is from Harvard Business Review. They have this nationality culture map. In modern terms, it's not always safe to talk about this, so I do this in sort of perhaps clumsily, but it's on the x-axis. It is, I think, the comfort with small talk and not wanting to spend small talk and get down to business, and on the y-axis, it is, I think, sort of, I don't know, I can't think of the right words, almost abrasiveness, you know, being confrontational versus non-confrontational. And Israel and Russia, I think, on top left in one corner. UK was actually quite central. Canada was, you know, at the other end. So I remember when I was at Microsoft, we acquired a Russian company, and that actually became Azure API Management, actually. And definitely felt that difference. And then there's another one, which is a very funny meme, which is what British people say, what they actually mean, and what other people hear. So we'll put those on screen for a second. It's pretty amusing.
A funny one for a dress up, and I don't remember the specific ones, but when someone says, you know, semi whatever, casual formal or whatever, sports whatever formal, I don't even know the sort of the terms of it. What does it mean? And in Israel it's like, oh, that's the thing you wore for your wedding, or the you know, like the most formal you've ever done. So there's a bunch of those, and
I think it's real. I think we got to acknowledge it and deal with it, right? There's definitely some differences. Okay, one thing I'm curious about, we haven't talked about much as a distributed company, are you folks heavily reading writing culture? So for example, I think Facebook was not a heavy reading writing culture. If someone came to me and said, where is the spec for this thing we're building, I'd be like, wow, you haven't been here very long. Like, we really didn't have sort of specs often. It was all done through collaboration, very sort of agile ideals, I guess. Whereas at Stripe, I think Patrick Collison down was a heavy reading. Like, you wrote long papers and you read all day, all night. Where does Snyk fall on that?
Yeah. First of all, I just sort of challenge a little bit, sort of saying that written or not written is an eye to agile. I mean, you can be like very heavily written and still be very agile. It's not written implies declaring your intent and sort of putting them in text, as opposed to like the level of specificity that you have it. And sort of
I take that from the mantra, which is collaboration over documentation. So I think that's where I take that from the agile. But I take your point.
I'd sort of say we're about sort of midway. So the fact that we worked, in a more distributed fashion, the fact that there were the difference in the work week, where one day one team was off versus the other every week. I think all of those led to still needing to discuss and declare intents a little bit more. But we did bias, and I think today we're much more sort of structured, but it's also just the sheer size. Biased in favor of informal communication. So there was a lot of written down things, but oftentimes they were on Slack channels and in conversation. The information was available. And I think that worked very well when we were small, and at some point it became a little bit of a detriment. Like Slack is a powerhouse, sort of a fire hose of information. We're a 1,000-person company, and there's practically no internal email in the company. Internal emails are announcements and things like that. Even those don't really happen. And Slack is for many years, including today, is an unmanageable beast. People come into it if they're not used to it, and it's just this volume of information. But once kind of harnessed, I think the casual conversation that you have within that is written documentation, and it has repeatedly demonstrated that someone new coming into a domain can go into that Slack channel and see not just the decision, but the decision-making process that happened. And so I think that has been true for Snyk, which is we've been very written, but oftentimes written as in kind of constant conversations, as opposed to like, hey, here's the precise specifications, which we do a decent amount of. And today more. But at the beginning we were much more like case by case on it.
Got it. That's very interesting. I've got to say actually, and to the people at Slack, I don't think there's anywhere where I want AI summarization capabilities more than Slack.
Yeah, and it's not available.
Is it? Okay, I haven't seen that. Please, thank you. Let's do that very quickly. So, I mean, we're coming towards the end now, but I obviously, we talk about culture a lot. I rarely get to have someone with such deep security expertise. Like, tell me about how should one think about security in engineering culture? Like, it's a thing. I think Snyk's kind of obviously a big part of what you do. How do you talk about that to other organizations? What does it mean internally inside Snyk?
So I think security is sometimes hard to embed into engineering or in software because it's naturally invisible. It doesn't hurt until it hurts really bad.
Right.
And as a result of that, it's not that developers don't care about security, but really two things are holding them back from tackling it correctly. One is that they don't see it. They don't. It has to be made more visible for them to actually notice it. They forget about it. It's easy to forget about. And the second is that it's just too hard. And so, as an industry, that's oftentimes the things that you need to tackle. That's a lot of what Snyk does, which is raise visibility, tell you about a problem, and then make it easy to address it. And I think the challenge we always kind of encounter when we deal with that is just what's the right level of noise. Like if I come in and I tell you about a problem again and again and again and again, you might not like me very much, even if I'm right every single time that I'm telling you. And so I think balancing that is probably a never-ending struggle for us, and we always try to juggle that. At some point, I think we've kind of moved past that, but at some point there was an interesting conflict between the positivity of the DevOps era of being so pro-user and the user is always right and accepting and saying when you got something, like just being very, very in favor of the user, and the maybe more adversarial thinking that you need a bit for security to say, well, what if the user is not nice? What if the user is an adversary? What if they try to do something incorrect to abuse the system? I think we're a little bit past that. I think that was more the early days of DevOps that we're just trying to be find the right balance, and so I see it in pockets. But I think that's less the concern. Today, I think the reality is that the rate of sort of software development is accelerating at a compounding pace.
Right.
You've had DevOps, you've had cloud, even before that you have Agile, now you have AI. We're writing software and changing software faster and faster and faster. And there is no way for anybody but the entity producing that code to be able to inspect it and say whether it is secure or not. And so I think it is critical to be able to sort of build secure applications to embed that into software development. And I think there are evolving practices, and I'm unhappy about where they are yet, around embedding that into software development methodologies. Do we talk about our vulnerability backlog in the sprint, in the daily meetings and in the sort of the planning meetings? Do we do we reward developers that have spent extra time so that they build something securely versus not? And so I think there's a lot that can be done. I think Ops is a good role model in many ways. There are many things that we've done taking the world of operations from the Department of No and the naysayer and the sort of, it's just downside protection to being perceived and accepted as an enabler, to being accepted as a if you're good at DevOps, then it actually is a top line advantage to the business. So security is on that journey. In the meantime, what I would love to see, and I think if you're sort of a forward-thinking engineering leader, is to think about how do you introduce security-related ceremonies and mentions into your process, and then subsequently you need to figure out how to make it easy. I think the tools are there. Snyk clearly kind of one option.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of it now is just you need it noticed. You need to raise it. Because otherwise you're not going to do anything.
Makes sense. And it's that sort of prevention versus cure, and the tensions about getting rewarded for the cure and not for the prevention, because you didn't. It's not visible what you prevented because it didn't happen, right?
And sometimes a negative selection bias on it. If I'm allowed to rant, which is like. I was very happy in terms of like the ecosystem to sort of see, for instance, GitHub start reporting on security alerts. The security alerts they provide today are very lacking. I think they'll admit that, which is they report far fewer issues than are sort of around. It doesn't matter really if it's intentional or technology gaps. I think mostly it's technology gaps. But the problem is once you start getting alerts and those alerts do not cover. They're not actually good, but you've been getting alerts, you think you're covered. And I think that's just dangerous. Like basically when you think you're okay, like when you start relying on saying, if there's a problem, this will tell me. So it's a very tricky balance. Like you want to raise visibility and it needs to be just at the edge of the wing.
Right.
Just to be, so that it's usable. And then, again, the leadership within engineering needs to promote looking at these as indicators of how you can build better software, as opposed to sort of bothersome things.
Well, one thing that strikes me with this is a trade-off between, we talked about ship it being like one of your cultural goals, and that means sometimes moving fast and cutting corners in some ways, right? It means like the product might not, you know that the user would want X and you don't do it because you suspect you'll get some feedback that's my thinking is I think they want it. But 9 times out of 10, I'm wrong, and they want something else. Vijay talked about this in an interview we did with him. How do you balance that when it comes to security, right? Like security is, a lot of overhead. I'm only putting this out for a few users. Is security where I should cut some corners?
Look, it is a balance, and so security is about risk management, and especially at the beginning, you have nothing to lose.
Right.
So to that extent, you want to ship it. Few things can take down your business overnight as much as a massive security issue.
Right.
And so at the beginning, you have less to lose. You'll probably end up sort of investing a little bit less in it.
Right.
You also, I think at the beginning, what you're really seeking is security culture. So you want people to just sort of raise, it's really simple things, like just put in your feature plans, in the template for your feature plans, ask, are there security implications, right? In your code review question, just ask. So, and you don't need it to be too systemized yet. As you grow, you need to evolve into having a security program. You need to bring yourself to a place in which you can be able to attest, you'd be able to sort of have some guarantees or some confidence that anything that made it to production has been at least through this type of diligence. So I think that's the transition, and that's also, that transition happens again and again as you invoke kind of new projects or things like that. If you don't have, it's a little bit like the sort of the dev adoption at the beginning. If you don't think about security, if you don't mention security, if security is just like, I really don't care right now from the beginning, it's going to be that much harder for you to instill that after. And employees will see that as big brother, as just sort of some onerous. If you instill at the beginning, they can perceive that as, we care about our customers, we perceive security as an aspect of quality, and we don't want to abuse the trust those customers gave us. And so we want to do it. You just don't have to have it be a system right away. I do think today, as startups, we're seeing more and more demand from early stage startups to have SOC 2 compliance. And I think the reason for that is because the world has kind of demonstrated that security is important. Their buyers, their customers are saying, give me something to show me that you care about security. And I think compliance does not equal security, but it does create a motivator. So what I like about that trend is that it now can, earlier on in your journey, give you an actual ROI that is not just about protecting the downside, but also improving the upside of security. So if you figure out how to, SOC 2 is the most repeated examples, especially when you're a B2B company. But in general, if you find ways to highlight your investments in security to your customers, that can lead to better business.
Yeah. This makes a lot of sense. It comes back to culture being a tool for telling folks in a very encoded way what you care about as an organization, right? And one of the things we talk about being we're a gateway, we're mission critical to a lot of our customers. If we go down, it's lights out for that customer. So we have a notion of if you're touching a mission critical part of the software, we call it tier 0 mission critical. The production gateway is sacrosanct, it's sacred, that can never go down. And so if you're touching a part of code that can affect that, then the level of sort of scrutiny, checks, attention to detail goes up much, much higher. Whereas if you're, I don't know, we have some side projects like rate my open API, it's less of a risk, less of a concern for the business, and so we'll be a little bit more relaxed in that case.
I think that's a very good point, which is different parts of your system, different stages are not the same. And I think for teams that are more maybe a mature experience with dealing with operational issues with resilience, oftentimes they correlate quite well, which is, if this is a system that you need to invest time and efforts to ensure it is resilient more than maybe other parts of your system. Oftentimes that goes hand in hand with security. It's not always, but oftentimes there's a correlation there, and you can apply some of those learnings and classifications to the two of them with relative ease.
Okay. One quick question before the last one. Why is it called Snyk? And what's the spelling come from?
Snyk is, so it started off because even though developer security was the core idea at Snyk, we thought we will get to runtime security relatively quickly and apply more of an observability approach to it, and we will sneak data out. And so it's Snyk, it's Sneak is the way to pronounce it, but we'll spell it with Y like the cool kids do.
So this is like Flickr, you were just sort of playing with nouns.
Exactly, it was just make it a bit more memorable. I do like, my previous company was called Blaze, and I had a real hard time in terms of, just of SEO or having that sort of bubble to the top. So I wanted a unique name. And then when I Googled that up, I found out I got an Urban Dictionary to see if there's any conflict or anybody call that. I got an Urban Dictionary hit that said Snyk is short for so now you know. So that clinched it. So Snyk is
kind of a good fit, right? So now you know. Oh wow, I'm glad I asked that question. What a great answer. Okay, the last question that everybody gets. Who should I ask on the show next and why?
So a question I've been very curious about recently is about the intersection of design and AI. And I'd be curious to ask Dylan, who I've met a couple of times, but haven't asked him this, what would he do differently creating Figma if he was creating it in a Gen AI surrounding?
Awesome. And do you know Dylan?
I know him lightly.
Make a little appeal to the camera there and tell him
Dylan, you should come on and answer that question and many more.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Guy. This has been awesome. I've really enjoyed it. I've learned a lot. One of the best things about doing this is I get to learn a lot about the culture I want to build at Zuplo as well. So many notes here. Thanks very much for joining us. Make sure you subscribe. We've got more great guests coming like Guy, hopefully Dylan as well. Thanks for watching Studio Z.
Thanks for having me.